Will Vladimir Putin legitimize the Wagner Group? The Russian president has ordered a former commander of the mercenary force to take charge of volunteer units in Ukraine. So, how could Putin profit from Wagner fighters? And could they be integrated into the army? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Mercenaries from Russia's Wagner Group are heading back to the front lines in Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin is believed to have put a former Wagner commander in charge of the force. There have been a lot of questions about the group's future after its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, led a failed uprising against the Kremlin. Now, it seems as if Wagner will continue to operate, but with greater oversight from Moscow. We'll go to our panel in a few moments, but first, Mohammed has this report.
The Wagner Group seems to be under new management. Russian President Vladimir Putin appeared on television with one of the mercenary group's top commanders. He tasked Andrei Troshev with organizing what he called volunteer fighters on the front lines in Ukraine.
You'll start to deal with the formation of volunteer units that could perform various combat tasks, primarily in the zone of the special military operation.
Putin is under pressure to strengthen Russia's offensive in Ukraine in any way he can. The conflict has ground to a stalemate, with neither side making significant gains in months. Wagner mercenaries had previously played a vital role in the war, but the group's future has been uncertain following the death of its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. The billionaire businessman was once a close ally of Putin. But in June, he led an unsuccessful mutiny against the Kremlin, accusing military leaders of incompetence. Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash in August. Western intelligence agencies say a bomb was on board. Moscow denies this and any involvement in his death. In addition to Ukraine, Wagner fighters have been active in Syria and several African countries, assisting governments in counterinsurgency operations. The Kremlin has always referred to the mercenaries as a private force and denied direct responsibility for their actions. But this may be changing. Putin is now publicly issuing orders to the man who appears to be Prigozhin's successor. Russia's deputy defense minister was also present at the meeting. Signs that the Kremlin may plan to exert more control over any new incarnation of the Wagner Group. Mohammed for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. Joining me from Moscow is Pavel Felgenhauer, an independent Russian defense analyst. In London is Michael Clarke, visiting professor at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And in Washington, D.C. is John Lechner, an independent researcher with a special focus on conflict in Africa and the author of a forthcoming book on the Wagner Group. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Pavel, let me start with you today. What message is President Putin sending to the world by appearing on television with Andrei Troshev? Is this, from your vantage point, a clear sign that the Kremlin will be exerting more control over the group?
Well, the Kremlin and President Putin aspire to control the group, or not the group, but what's left of it, because they clearly need the fighters of Wagner. They're needed primarily on the Ukrainian front line, but also their operations in Middle East and Africa too. So yes, that's what basically Putin was doing from the entire kind of crisis of the Wagner crisis. I mean, after they retreated from Moscow, there was a meeting in the Kremlin between Putin and the Wagner Group leadership. And then he was also pressing the same thing, that what you did was bad, what your leadership did was bad, that was a bad thing. But you're good guys, you should kind of go and fight for Mother Russia. So yes, that's what they want. They want Wagner, but without its leadership. Now there is no leadership left. It was all wiped out in this plane crash last month. And so now they want to encourage the Wagner fighters and the Wagner lucrative operations in Africa and the Middle East.
And Pavel, how easy or difficult will it be to fold the Wagner Group into the Russian military? A lot of Wagner fighters had left the Russian army in the past, and it doesn't seem that they would be too enthusiastic about the idea of being under the auspices of the defense ministry. Would they actually want to fight alongside Russian forces going forward?
Oh, some did sign contracts, but their hierarchy, they're kind of the a cadre of the Wagner Group, and it's a kind of loose organization. I mean, it's like it can expand easily. They have a big book of former veterans, which they, as they know, are good specialists. They can call them up when there's money to be paid and a mission to be accomplished. And there's the kind of about 1,000, over 1,000. These are the command structure people, and they are also practically all of them are former military personnel up to rank of colonel, and they left the military specifically because they didn't like how the generals were running the Russian military. So they are kind of armed dissidents, and up to now their vast majority has been refusing to sign contracts with the defense ministry. So Khrushchev is kind of, it's like a substitute. If you don't want to deal directly with the defense ministry, here's Khrushchev, you know him, he's one of your own, and you can kind of deal through him.
John, after the aborted mutiny in June, many thought that the Wagner Group would be folded into the Russian Ministry of Defense based on President Putin's remarks while meeting with Andrei Troshev. Is that process now underway? Is that what you think that we are seeing?
Yeah, I agree with Pavel. I think that we are seeing that process, which is certainly taking some time. I think it's difficult right now to talk about exactly what that is going to look like, because I think, as Pavel had said before, Wagner, we can think of it much more as a contracting organization. It has far fewer permanent employees than it has, as Pavel mentioned, these lists of contacts of men with military experience who they can recruit for specific missions. And when the contract is over, say a 2-year contract, a 1-year contract, those fighters can go on to another organization. It used to be in the past that it was difficult for them to go to another PMC and then come back to Wagner, because Wagner was kind of a jealous organization and they could be blacklisted. But essentially, they were free agents afterwards. And so I think when we're thinking about control, what we have to look at is sort of the permanent staff. And as far as we've seen so far in Africa and in Syria, the same faces have largely stuck around, which implies that they're continuing to work and that they will likely fall under whatever this new structure will be.
John, let me just check with you. When you say PMC, you're talking about private military companies, right?
That's correct, yes.
All right. John, let me also ask you about the fact that President Putin ordered Andrei Troshev to take charge of volunteer units in Ukraine. How long do you think that process might take? I mean, what kind of timeline are we looking at? And how much impact might that have on the ground in Ukraine?
I'm not sure exactly on the timeline. That's probably difficult to tell, and I think it will very much depend on individuals who want to go back to the front. I'm sure that there are a decent amount of Wagner fighters who do believe, obviously, in the war in Ukraine and do want to return. There's also a number of fighters who, probably having experienced Bakhmut, would prefer to be in safer conflicts in Africa as well and avoid Ukraine. But I think ultimately we have to remember that at least since the mutiny and since about May 10th, when Prigozhin declared victory in Bakhmut and handed the city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine over to the Ministry of Defense, Wagner has not been on the front. It has not been participating in the war in Ukraine. And so all the developments that we've seen most recently with Ukraine's counteroffensive and the Russians doing a relatively effective job of holding that at bay has come without the participation of Wagner. And so, well, I think that certainly Wagner represents a high degree of military talent, especially with a number of their commanders. I'm hesitant to say that their re-entrance into the conflict will be a make or break for either Ukraine or Russia.
Michael, how much pressure is President Putin under to strengthen Russia's offensive in Ukraine?
Quite a lot. The Russian forces are stretched at the moment. They're holding their positions, but only just because they've got no operational reserve. So they're having to take forces from one area of the front to put them to another. So 5 regiments of the VDV, the airborne, from the 7th and the 76th divisions have already been transferred to the Orikhiv front, which is the main battlefront at the moment, and the whole of the 42nd Mechanized Infantry are down there as well, brigade, doing a lot more fighting. So the Russians haven't got a mobile reserve. They are relatively short of troops, and President Putin is hanging on for the winter. He's hanging on for the bad weather, trying not to lose very much territory. And then when the weather turns bad in about 4 to 6 weeks, then he hopes he can recalibrate his strategy after that.
Michael, let me also ask you about the fact that, you know, for a long time, the narrative that seemed to be emerging from the Kremlin was that Russia's government really had nothing to do with Wagner. So is what we're seeing now an about-face? And if so, does this surprise you?
No, not at all. I mean, we all knew that Putin was lying completely when he said he claimed not to know anything about Wagner. He claimed that they had no relationship to the Kremlin. Then he made it clear. I mean, and this was a group that used to go to the Kremlin to receive medals, even when he knew nothing about it, apparently. And then in the teeth of the coup after the 24th of June, he's so angry. He made it clear how much they paid Wagner and all these contracts that Wagner had. And now he's not even trying to pretend that Wagner isn't formally part of the whole war machine. That's not to say that the Kremlin has control over Wagner. Clearly it didn't have, but it was an instrument that was created in 2013, 2014 that he found useful to use, and he's used it ever since. So it's no surprise whatsoever that he's saying what he now says. I mean, you know, nobody believed him then, and he may now be telling the truth, but there's no guarantee of that either.
Pavel, let me ask you a version of the question I just asked Michael. For a long time, the Kremlin referred to the mercenaries as a private force. They had denied direct responsibility for Wagner's actions. This is just no longer the case, right?
Oh, yes, that's losing plausible deniability, because Russian officials and President Putin personally, when there's something going wrong, wasn't say in Libya or somewhere else, say, I don't know these people are independent, they go where they wish. And now we can't say that if they're under the auspices of the Russian Defense Ministry, and he apparently personally is involved in micromanaging the command structure of Wagner, or former Wagner, or derivative Wagner Group. I mean, he can't say that I don't control them anymore. So yes, that excuse has been decisively lost.
And Pavel, earlier John was talking about the fact that Wagner doesn't seem to be participating in any frontline battles at this stage in Ukraine. I want to ask you about that. How much of a battlefield role have Wagner fighters had in Ukraine since Bakhmut was recaptured by them? Have any Wagner mercenaries redeployed to the front line in eastern Ukraine and joined the Russian military there?
Well, they played a decisive role in the bloodbath of Bakhmut, and before that, they are very vicious battlefield fighters, well trained and apparently well motivated. And after the bloodbath of Bakhmut, they were withdrawn for recuperation, and then there were different kind of conflicts between Prigozhin and the top brass of the Russian military. So as a group, they are not at the front, but apparently quite a number of individual fighters who did actually sign contracts with the defense ministry after Wagner was withdrawn have been apparently reported to being on the front line, but there we're talking about maybe several hundred, not that much.
John, in the short term, does this move benefit President Putin? Does it ultimately put him in a stronger position?
I think it does in terms of the overall narrative, which the Kremlin is trying to put forward, that Wagner is back under the control of the Russian government. It's now under the control of the Ministry of Defense. But I think we have to remember, what do we mean by control in the first place? At the end of the day, the way the Putin system has historically functioned is that there's often very little guidance from the center, from Putin himself. And this gives quite a lot of freedom for powerful individuals and oligarchic interests to go out and pursue profit-making activities, framing it as foreign policy. And as long as they can kind of frame it within Russia's national interest and the greater narrative of Russia as a great power, there's really no contradiction in terms of them also making money out of the venture as well. And so I think what we're seeing right now is an effort to recreate the narrative that Wagner is under the control by putting a few people kind of in top positions and in place. But that doesn't necessarily mean that on the ground in the Central African Republic, on the ground in Mali, this sort of centralized but decentralized structure will kind of continue to run, not necessarily with the MOD knowing everything that's going on.
Michael, we've spoken a lot already in this episode about Wagner's role in Ukraine. But in addition to Ukraine, Wagner fighters have also been active in several African countries, assisting governments with counterinsurgency operations. Is this something that's going to continue?
Yes, and they'll develop it. They've created a sort of model for this. So Wagner have been involved in Libya, supporting General Haftar, who's a part of the breakaway alternative government in Libya based in Benghazi. They've been doing that for a long time in the Central African Republic. They're now very much involved in Mali, essentially the coup in Mali, threw the Western powers out, threw the French out and brought in Wagner. Niger is doing the same, throwing the West out, throwing French out, but they haven't yet let in Wagner fighters, it seems. There have been some clashes apparently on the border between some Al-Qaeda fighters and Wagner fighters. Not sure how serious that is. But what Wagner have done is created this business model, really, whereby they'll sign up with any dictator and they'll do the dirty work, whatever it is. Even if it's genocide, that's fine. They don't really mind about that. They'll do any amount of dirty work in return for a share of the national wealth. And that usually means mining concessions or sharing the gold mines, the gold mining in somewhere like Mali, and there's a lot of gold in Niger. There'll be minerals, and in some cases oil as well in the case of Libya. And that's a business model which has been expanding. So there are Wagner people who run breweries, they run insurance companies, travel companies. It's not just a military organization. It is actually a conglomerate which can franchise itself, and it's an arm of Russian influence. Although the Russian government hasn't taken that much advantage of it so far, I think the expectation is that it will in the future.
John, I saw you reacting to some of what Michael was saying there. Looked like you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think Michael is right on point that we're going to continue to see Wagner operate in Africa because, as he said, Wagner has created a product. It's created a market for its services. And even I think if Wagner were to suddenly disappear from Africa, we would likely see, other countries with these kind of public-private partnerships try to step in and fill the void. I think it's important to note that Wagner is coming about at a very interesting time now in Africa in general, where we've seen some very kind of real anti-French sentiment, real kind of interest in Africa's youth for a further round of decolonization, which has come at the expense of France's relationships with many of its former colonies. But at the same time, African governments also don't have an alternative security partner to Western interventions or United Nations peacekeeping missions, if for whatever reason they choose that they don't want those to be there. And so Wagner has benefited as well from this structure as essentially the only alternative security partner, no matter how brutal they might be, for African governments. And Wagner also, Michael had mentioned that, they're a tool of Russian influence, I would go a bit further and say that, in Africa, the Russian government's historical presence, at least since the Cold War, has been relatively minimal. And this gave Prigozhin a lot of leash to essentially go out there and create what he thought Russia's interests in Africa should be.
Pavel, what about you? What do you say? Do you foresee that Wagner's footprint in Africa is going to expand going forward?
Sorry to pour some cold water on that, but I believe that the Wagner operation in Africa is in deep trouble, if not totally doomed. Because Wagner has been decapitated. There is no more Wagner. And if they lost, yes, their top military commander, Dmitry Utkin, in the plane crash, but their military structure is more or less intact. At least it's so the fighters are there, the commanders are there. Their financial economics have been really wiped out. There's no Prigozhin. There's no Mr. Chernikov, who's also died in that crash, was the main logistics and financial operator. So how that's going to work? I mean, Wagner was lean and mean. They operated like organized crime syndicate or like, a Mexican drug cartel. I mean, everything was paid in cash, on time. Everyone knew, every fighter knew that he'll get his money or his family will get his compensation without any bureaucracy, without any papers, just bags of cash. And this cash, there was concessions on gold and diamonds and so on. And that was transferred by Prigozhin into cash, and also cash from the Kremlin, all put together, all worked. And now it's the defense ministry, which is, the Russian defense ministry is not a criminal syndicate. It's all total bureaucracy, over 2 million employees. There's corruption there, sure, and that means the fighters that are still in Africa will soon figure that they're not getting their money in time or in full. They're getting it through the defense ministry that goes only through bank wires to Russian cards of Russian banks. And there's been so much complaint in Ukraine that the money is not coming in time. So I don't see how this Wagner economic model can be workable under the Russian state bureaucracy. I think it's going to all begin to disintegrate, and rather soon.
John, if we could just take a step back for a moment, I want to ask you about how important Africa is both economically and politically to Russia, and whether or not Russia actually tries to expand the Wagner footprint in Africa. Will the Kremlin face challenges in keeping a strong presence in Africa?
I think so. I mean, I think, as I was saying earlier, Wagner has been able to create what Russia's interests in Africa were, because Russia's interests in Africa at the time were certainly not that great. It's not an important trade partner for Russia. It doesn't factor significantly into Russia's national security interests. It's never mentioned in Russian military doctrine or kind of political aspirations. And so I think since the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year, I think that the narrative, the geopolitical narrative of Russia as a partner for Africa has become more important, essentially to show that Russia is not geopolitically isolated, to show people at home, to show on the international stage that there are still many countries that want to do business with Russia. I disagree. Well, I guess I disagree slightly with Pavel. I agree that the Ministry of Defense won't be able to take over and absorb all of Wagner's economic operations, which is why I'm skeptical that the Ministry of Defense is necessarily going to try and take over all of these operations. There is still, Prigozhin was undoubtedly a charismatic figure whose ideas were always kind of keeping this organization together. But there were still a lot of operators at the level right below him who know how it worked. And he's essentially created these companies that are going concerns. And I think if we even take the analogy of, a Mexican cartel or something else along those lines, usually with cartels as well, that if the head is taken out, the cartel still morphs and then kind of continues to go on in a different form. And so I think we have to be specific as well that perhaps what we're going to see in the future is not something that is exactly Wagner as we've seen as we see it today. But Wagner has gone through multiple iterations in its very short history. And so the same issues of supply and demand, the fact that there's a lot of supply of Russian mercenaries, there's a demand, and there's still a lot of creative entrepreneurial people within the organization and within Russia itself, I think points to the fact that a version of this will continue for quite some time.
Michael, we only have a couple of minutes left, but let me ask you, would President Putin have considered disbanding the Wagner Group? I ask that because I'm curious to get your thoughts on if that would have been a very risky move for him, just essentially having all those fighters on the loose and not within that group anymore.
Yeah, I mean, he was always faced with a problem after the attempted coup or whatever it was in June. I mean, it's clear that the Wagner people were not going to go into the ordinary military. For all sorts of reasons, they wouldn't. It was most likely they'd either drift into other PMCs, and there are plenty of them around. There's 15 or 20 of them in Ukraine itself, PMCs run by different Russian figures, including Shoigu, the defense minister. He's got his own. Timchenko runs Redut, which is quite like Wagner. So they were always going to drift into other groups or keep them together in one idea, keep them in Belarus, where they train the Belarusian army and use that as a base for further operations. That idea has sort of faded a little bit. But they're always a dangerous force for Putin. They only used to be 5,000 or 10,000, but now there seems to be about 40,000 of them. About 100,000 people have cycled through Wagner. So it is actually a consequential group. And it's probably safer for him to try to keep it together with a different role, rather than just let it dissolve and become a problem elsewhere.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Pavel Felgenhauer, Michael Clarke, and John Lechner. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.